the August edition of the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about cloud migration planning, some methodologies and approaches. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm joined today by Steve Longenecker.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
All right, so before we begin, we're going to have a couple quick tips on your webinar. Definitely ask questions. There's a nice question/chat utility that GoToWebinar provides, and we love to get questions and comments throughout the webinar. We do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but we really like this to be as interactive an experience as possible. On that note, we also we're trying to get a bit of a conversation going on Twitter using the hashtag #ToTheCloud. That'll be at the bottom of every slide. So if you have any comments or anything you want to, anything that you hear that sounds good to you, go ahead and tweet that out using the hashtag #ToTheCloud. You can also send a tweet our way at Community IT. If possible, please avoid multitasking. We're going to go pretty quickly. We have a lot of content to go through today, and we're going to go pretty quickly through the webinar to try to get everything covered. So do your best to stay focused on the webinar. If you don't, or if something comes up and you have to leave us for any reason, we are going to provide the PowerPoint at slideshare.com, and the recording will be posted to our YouTube channel. And all of that can be seen on our website, and we will also be sending an email out after the webinar with links to both of those resources. Quick note about Community IT. We are a partner that works with nonprofit organizations to help them solve their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. Some of the things that make us unique are our strategic approach. Our goal really is to help nonprofits use technology more effectively. We believe that in order to do that, we really need to understand the strategy that the organizations are pursuing and make sure that the technology solutions they use fit that strategy. We're a collaborative organization. We work collaboratively with each other and with our clients. We have a team of over 40 staff who will help you to make informed IT decisions. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community. We've worked with over 900 nonprofits since 1993. That's our sole focus. It's what we do. So, my name, as I mentioned before, is Johan Hammerstrom. I'm the president here at Community IT. If you want to connect with me after the webinar, you can shoot me, as they say, an email at jhammerstrom@communityit.com. I'm also pretty active on Twitter, and I definitely respond to Twitter mentions, so you can reach me there.
And my name is Steve Longenecker, and I'm a project manager at Community IT. I'm just thinking about the fact that I'm coming up on 10 years at Community IT, and it's been a great place to work for this past decade. I've worked with a lot of our clients on implementing various projects and enjoy that capacity of what we do for our clients.
All right, so let's get into the webinar itself. So quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. First and foremost, what is cloud computing? I'm not sure it's a buzzword anymore. It's just kind of part of the accepted parlance of contemporary IT solutions. But we want to dive a little bit into what cloud computing is, talk about the different kinds of clouds out there, because that's something that I think often doesn't get discussed, is the fact that when people talk about the cloud, they're actually referring to a wide variety of types of solutions. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the considerations, some of the things that you should be thinking about for your organization as to whether or not you want to move into the cloud, how much you want to go into the cloud. And then we're going to get into the methodology that we like to follow and help our clients use to make good decisions about when and where in their organization it makes sense to use cloud resources. And then we'll close with some best practices. So what is the cloud? Well, broadly speaking, the cloud is, this is the kind of dictionary definition, an architecture that provides scalable, internet accessible services. And so basically, cloud is a computing platform. You don't know exactly where it is. You don't know the hardware that it sits on, but you can get to it through the internet, and generally it can scale beyond the limits of what we previously could have done with fixed hardware. So that's basically the cloud. And actually, the cloud was really described and discussed um, really accurately all the way back in 2008 in a book by Nicholas Carr called The Big Switch. And in that book, Nicholas Carr sort of went back to the turn of the last century, the late 1800s, to talk a little bit about power and how electricity was, sort of used and delivered in the United States at that time. And it turned out that in the 1890s, there was no such thing as a power utility that was delivering power on a power grid. Instead, every factory had its own power plant on premise that it used to generate the power to do its manufacturing. So you'd go to a city like Chicago, which was one of the largest cities in the country back in the 1890s, and every little factory and warehouse in Chicago had its own power plant that was burning coal, generating its own electricity for doing its work, and it was very inefficient. That all changed in the turn of the century with the invention of the power utility, and basically, the all of those factories no longer relied on generating their own power. Instead, they purchased power from electrical power from utilities that could generate it at a much larger scale and in much more efficient ways. So it was more environmentally efficient, more efficient all around. And so the analogy that Nicholas Carr drew in this book is that, the turn of this century, in the 1990s, early 2000s, think about your own organization. You probably have a server or two in your closet, and you're doing all of your computing power on premise. But the reality is it's much more efficient to do computing power in much larger data centers. And as the ability to access that computing power grows, the the way that organizations do computing is going to transform as well. Instead of doing it on their own in their office with their own little sort of server slash power generator, they'll be moving to more of a utility grid model. So that was the analogy that Nicholas Carr drew in 2008, and I think it remains relevant to this day. The key thing to keep in mind or to remember is and one of the great things about that analogy is the fact that what made the power utility possible back in the turn of the 1900s was power lines, the ability to transmit electrical power efficiently over long distances. And by the same token, the thing that makes cloud computing possible today is the advent of sort of ubiquitous high-speed internet. If you can go to the next slide. So that's really what we're talking about in some ways when we're talking about the cloud. It's the fact that whether you're connecting from your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop, your desktop, the fact that you have the ability to get on the internet easily gives you access to resources that are, in many ways anywhere in the world. And for that reason, there's no longer, it no longer makes sense for organizations to necessarily do all of their computing on premise, on their own hardware in their office. And that's been a big part of what's driven sort of this cloud computing revolution.
So I'm going to talk now about sort of the different kinds of cloud architectures that are out there. The cloud has been certainly a buzzword and sort of means everything to everyone or anything to anyone. But it's sort of filtered. There's been some greater definition about what cloud computing can be, and this pyramid sort of shows how it can work, and it's an inverted pyramid, which is kind of interesting. So at the top, and we can go from top to bottom or bottom to top, but at the top we have these AASs things, and that's as a service. And so the question is, what are you getting as a service? Because the whole idea of the cloud is that it's being delivered to you as a service rather than something that you're buying, like the units of production. You're not buying the means of production. You're just buying the services from some cloud vendor. So software as a service is the one that impacts the end users the most. And when we would ask our organization, our clients, do you use the cloud services, sometimes the answer, people say no, no, we need to do that. We need to think about that. We know it's important, but everything we have everything in our server. Everything's running in our server in the proverbial closet that Johan mentioned, and that is generally true. But almost everyone generally actually does probably use some software as a service um, cloud services. So the ones that I think of that almost everyone uses, it's almost all of our clients do, email lists, mail blasts, I guess you might call them, where you send out emails to all of your constituents and all of your customers and at a time, and very few people are trying to run that off of an on-premise service. We do have some clients who do for various reasons, but almost everyone's using MailChimp, or there's a whole bunch of them. I shouldn't pick on MailChimp particularly, but there's a whole bunch of them. Also, very almost everyone has some HR functions in the cloud these days. So that's software as a service, where you're sort of paying for an end user account to log in as an end user and access some services, and you're doing it over the internet. Oftentimes you're doing it in a web browser, not always. An example of software as a service that isn't necessarily through a browser would be Office 365 email, where the service is still software as a service, but you may be accessing it through the Outlook client, through the Outlook 2013, which is a piece of software that's installed on your computer, but it connects to the cloud. Of course, you might be using your mobile phone email application. That's also an application. It's not necessarily being done through a browser. So that's software as a service. That's the most common thing that end users see. Platform as a service is very important, and definitely something that impacts sort of the overall technology landscape, but probably doesn't touch most of our clients much at all. Platform as a service is where development platforms are made available to people for them to sort of set up their own applications that then can be run, but the applications use the services that are provided in the platform. We're going to show some examples of this in some subsequent slides, so that's what I won't say anything more about that right now. But this is the middle of the pyramid that, in some ways, it's probably simplest just to skip in terms of thinking about what services most of our clients would actually be purchasing. The bottom of the pyramid is something that some of our clients do use. That's infrastructure as a service. And it's still a cloud service in the sense that a certain amount of it's abstracted from you, but in a sense, instead of buying an email service, you might buy a virtual server from a cloud vendor, and you're not worried about the motherboards or the disks or the hardware itself. That's abstracted from you. What you're buying is a certain amount of sort of server horsepower, a certain amount of bandwidth that connects to it, a certain amount of uptime in a sense. I mean, it should always be up, hopefully, but you have an SLA that's committing to a certain amount of uptime, and you pay a certain amount of money for that server, but then you're responsible for sort of the server maintenance, for like patching the server, for installing software on the server. So this can be an option where there isn't a software for our clients who are many of them are on the smaller scale, and software as a service, the economies of scale make software as a service attractive, and so when software as a service is an option, Office 365, for example, MailChimp, for example, software service makes a lot of sense. But there are times when software as a service isn't an option, where no vendor has exploited that market yet, and so you still need to run your application that's important to your operations on a server. You have been running it on your on-premise server that's in your server closet, but maybe you could run it instead on infrastructure as a service cloud virtual server.
And I think one of the things that's interesting is there's kind of layers upon layers of cloud now. And so, Netflix is actually so. Amazon Web Services, as we'll show a little bit later, is sort of the classic infrastructure as a service where Amazon at one point, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, Jeff Bezos realized they had all this excess server capacity, and they basically packaged that into this infrastructure as a service, and you can, on a utility basis, purchase computing power, storage, database, all of the things you see there at the bottom layer. And it turns out that Netflix is Amazon Web Services' largest customer. So every time you go, so we sort of interact as consumers with Netflix as software as a service. We connect to the interface, fire up the movie on our phone or on our Blu-ray player at home. But it turns out that Netflix is using Amazon Web Services to store and run, its entire business basically, which is kind of, can be, some people consider that amusing because Netflix's biggest competitor is Amazon's instant video, on-demand video service. So there's kind of chances are, you're probably using multiple layers of cloud, even if all you're seeing is software as a service. And that's really the direction that the industry as a whole is headed in.
So this is the example of the soft. We have our mashup of icons of software as a service um, examples. So some of the vendors that I already mentioned: Office 365, Gmail, Google's mail service is on here. Google Docs, all that stuff that's in Google fits into that software as a service. In some cases, with Gmail as a consumer, you may not be paying anything for it, so it's software as a free service, but it's nonetheless, a classic SaaS application. Box as a file sharing service, Skype as an instant message service. Many, many, many more icons could be squeezed onto this already crowded slide. One that I'll highlight here is that Salesforce is software as a service, CRM, where you pay, for each user account to log into your Salesforce CRM that is a service that's in the cloud that you can access on your mobile device or whatever, and that's all classic software as a service, and it can keep track of your constituents and when you last met with them, when you last contacted them, and so forth, all the things that a CRM will do for you. So I want to just mention that, hold that thought, because we're going to see that Salesforce sort of appears later on, well, immediately later on. So in this next slide, this is the platform as a service slide. And you have the Force.com cloud platform, which is essentially what Salesforce is running on, but Salesforce is running on it, while Salesforce is running on it, other applications can be running on it as well. So when you go to see, when you go to a Salesforce demonstration or something, everyone's very excited about all the great things that Salesforce can do, and they're really giving you a good sales job on it. It may be that you're seeing Salesforce, or it may also be that you're seeing Salesforce working with other third-party applications that are running on this platform as a service, and that to do all of these workflows, you would invest not only in Salesforce, but you'd be investing in third-party apps that are running on the Force.com platform. SharePoint is not on here, but SharePoint is becoming more and more as a platform as a service also, and it's one that is probably also could become more and more important to our clients as Office 365 is aimed so clearly, well, that there's such a good pricing for SharePoint through Office 365 for nonprofits. There are third-party apps that run on the SharePoint platform.
And I think a good analogy for that is maybe the Access, Microsoft Access, which sort of, came onto the scene back in the late 90s and was very exciting because you could build your own database. And in many ways, Access was a platform. But I think now, sort of the last decade or decade and a half, there's just tons of Access horror stories where, well, we had an intern who knew Access and they built this Access database for us, and then they left, and now no one knows what to do with it. That same sort of risk, if you will, exists in those platforms as a service. And so, if you choose to kind of build your own app on a platform, you need to make sure you're kind of looking at the long term. By the same token, it does create a lot of opportunity, and I think one of the great things Salesforce did was to open up its platform and make it commercially available. And so it created sort of a really vibrant and vigorous app marketplace, um, that there's just a ton of third-party apps that you can purchase and use alongside Salesforce, and there's even the option to do custom development on Force.com and integrate that with your Salesforce deployment. But you want to, those are all things that you want to be careful about and approach in a deliberate manner, which we'll get into in a couple slides down.
So this is the infrastructure as a service slide. These are the three big players in the market right now. Amazon Web Services is the sort of the one that laid the uh, groundwork, I guess, or it was the sort of, I don't know if they were the first on the scene, but they were certainly the ones that made a big splash and sort of got everybody thinking about this possibility. So again, here you're paying for virtual hardware as a service. You don't need to worry or think about what kind of CPUs or motherboards, whatever, is sort of supporting all of this. It could be that your virtual server is running on different hardwares in different parts of the data center on different days. It doesn't matter to you. You just know that you get this particular virtual server. Could be Linux servers, often in our clients' cases, a Windows server. And this is the thing, this is an important service that does matter to our clients. I'm in discussions right now with a client that has a particular association management system that doesn't have a software as a service option. It only is something that software that you buy and install on your server. They've always had it running on their on-premise server, but a couple months ago, their local network was down for a weekend, and they felt like their member services suffered for that weekend, and they wanted to see what they could do to sort of insulate themselves from that possibility. And you could certainly build out your on-premise hardware a lot to try to minimize that, but really that doesn't scale too well for a small association. What happens if the local power goes bad, goes down for the weekend? Are you going to put in a generator in your office? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's too expensive. But to have Amazon handle all of that for you is great, or SoftLayer, or Azure. So this part of the cloud pyramid is all about, and it is something that our clients are using and will continue to use, I think. Again, I think when there's a good software as a service option, that's generally where we would point our clients first, but they're just not always available.
So, are you ready to go? You're probably already in the cloud, and I guess the question becomes, what next? Does it make sense to move everything into the cloud? What are some of the considerations that you need to take into account, as you get ready to move into the cloud, or before? Or if you're already there, what should you be thinking about? Because it's certainly not too late. So we're going to go through that. Some of the biggest things to think about are, first of all, the security and privacy. And I think this is probably front of mind for most people when they think about moving their information to the cloud. I think one of the surprising things is that oftentimes moving your data to the cloud can actually make it more secure. One of the things that we've told our clients, we've moved a lot of people over to Office 365 over the last few years, and when the question comes up of how secure their email is going to be, our response is usually, that email is being hosted in a large server environment with hundreds of security professionals, sort of who built that network out, who architected it, who are monitoring logs, 24/7. There's a level of security that they can provide that we never could, with a small Exchange server that you have in your closet. So, by and large, the cloud is as or more secure than an on-premise solution would be, but it is important to give that some thought.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
if I could interrupt, another
sure.
place where I think security and privacy and the cloud sort of match up in a way that people sometimes they think, oh, insecure, the cloud, it's insecure, it's public, whatever. But another place where we've seen it be very helpful to our clients is when they are worried about PCI compliance
Hmm.
and compliance like that, where the regulations say you need to sort of separate this from your day-to-day local area network. And they've, for whatever reason, people have, certain servers on their local internet network. They had historically that way, and now regulations are saying that really isn't allowed anymore. And how do I do that? And there's all sorts of things you can do on premise, but just moving that server or those servers that are involved in credit card application, credit card processing or whatever, to a cloud service, infrastructure as
Hmm.
a service, is sometimes the simplest thing to do.
Yeah, great example. That's a really good point. There's a now sort of dated study, and I forgot exactly where it is, that the University of California at Berkeley did. It's got to be 3 or 4 years ago at this point. They were deciding whether to go to Office 365 and or Google Apps, and you can imagine all of the security concerns, both externally and internally from students, as well as compliance, regulations that they had. Facing them, and they basically found after an extensive study that Office 365 was a little bit more secure, but that both met their requirements for security. Um, so, uh, internet, but it's going to vary widely from solution to solution. So you kind of need to look at the specific, solution that you're considering. Internet stability is an important one, and this is also another big question that people often have. If I have everything in the cloud, then what happens when my internet connection goes down? And I think we've been getting that question less and less, over the last 5 years, and I think that is largely due to the fact that these days, everything kind of screeches to a halt when your internet connection is down. We tend to recommend for most offices having dual internet, and in fact, the things being out, information being in the cloud is actually a plus, because if there's a power event, you're here in DC, we have hurricanes come through. There can be snowstorms in the winter. Power goes out for a couple of days. Your office doesn't have power. If all of your information was on on-premise server, you wouldn't be able to access any of it. But with it being in the cloud, your staff can work from home, and if their internet's up there, they can still get all of their information. So that can be kind of a positive. I think the big concern around internet stability really is more with NGOs and international organizations that have staff that travel around the world, and are often working in parts of the world where reliable internet isn't as good as it is here, or is there's a lot of problems with getting on the internet. And I think if you are an NGO and you're thinking about moving information to the cloud, that's something that you really need to take a close look at. One of the things that I've heard is that Office 365 tends to not work as well in situations where there's low bandwidth, because it's sort of been built with this rich user experience that requires a lot of bandwidth, and Google Apps tends to be a little bit, to work a little bit better. So I think in anecdotally, my sense is that there's a higher percentage of NGOs using Google Apps for that reason.
But
Another
though
big,
in those,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead, Steve.
in
No.
those situations, also, oftentimes cloud services, if you're not relying on the browser, the browser is kind of like it's on or it's off. But if you're using a client, a piece of client software that interacts with the software as a service, then you can be offline and get some productive work done. And then when you do have internet access, it can sync up. And more software as a service products, particularly ones that are aimed at NGO international organizations, would have that requirement in mind.
Hmm. Yep. Um, CapEx to OpEx, that just refers to the fact that switching to the cloud can change how you pay for your IT services. And so, the having a server farm or a couple servers on premise was typically handled as a capital expense. So every 3 to 5 years, you'd have to outlay a lot of money for purchasing the hardware, the software, and the labor for getting it deployed. And that turns from being, a 5 year significant cost into an ongoing cost for a service. And I've seen that some organizations love it. It works a lot better with how their funding works and how they do their finances. For other organizations, it can be a big challenge. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as you're looking at making the switch to a cloud service. And then finally, last but certainly not least, and in fact probably the most important, is data ownership. And I think one of the biggest changes really, is that the data goes from being on a server that you own and control to being, out in the cloud and in a place where you don't necessarily own or control that data any longer. And once again, that varies widely from service to service. And it's really important that as you're considering a cloud service for your organization, that you look closely at the terms of service. And I would even recommend getting your legal counsel involved in looking at the terms of service, particularly if there's regulation or compliance involved. So we've got two examples here. The first one comes from Box. Many of you have probably heard of Box. Some of you may be using Box. But if you get into the fine print of Box's terms of service, you'll see that they say that they reserve the right to temporarily suspend or to terminate your access to the service at any time in their sole discretion, with or without cause, with or without notice. And this isn't necessarily a deal killer, but it's important, for you as an organization to understand that there is some amount of risk created by this term of service, and how are you going to work around that risk? If you're putting all your eggs in that basket and they decide to follow through on this clause in their terms of service, it could cause real problems for your organization. Now, obviously, Box is actually they're kind of in a land war right now, trying to add as many customers as they can. So for them to do anything that would cause bad publicity seems really unlikely. But they have, the legal right to do that based on their terms of service. So, maybe it's acceptable for you to take on that risk, but you're gonna hedge it a little bit by making sure that you've got all of your data, all of your files and documents stored in another location. And then kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got TwitPic, where they basically say you retain all the copyrights to all the photos and videos that you post. It's your content. Um, you know, they can distribute it, but it basically belongs to you. So there's really just a really wide range of terms of service. And I know none of us like reading that fine print. We want to just kind of click through it as quickly as we can. That may be fine if you're using something like TwitPic, where it's just something you're using personally. But for your organization to really invest in storing its data with a cloud service, really important to look at those terms of service. I think the other issue around terms of service has to do with potential legal action. And I know we work with a few organizations that are kind of constantly under threat of one form of legal action or another. And they've been unable to some degree to move all of their information out to the cloud, because generally, if one of these cloud service providers is served a subpoena, they're going to hand the data over. And some of the organizations that we've worked with in the past, have wanted to reserve the right to resist the subpoena, and they could only do that if the data was kind of in-house and on-premise. So once again, that's certainly not going to be the case for every organization. It really depends on the work that they're doing, but that's an important thing to be aware of.
Related to data ownership, or loosely related to data ownership. I would also say that there's something changing about cloud services that isn't related to terms of service particularly, and in some ways it has more to do with the way cloud services operate, even on premise the same thing, but it has to do with like data sprawl and the fact that having stuff in the cloud can um, can generate a feeling among your staff that sort of this data is everywhere, it's in the cloud, it's everywhere, it's anywhere, it doesn't, I don't have to worry about it. And so the potential for sort of having data leakage or losing data, or losing control of data, because of the practices of your end users, of your staff, is something of a concern. Now that can happen anyway, but I think the cloud has sort of been, in some ways, the cloud has been driving, a continuing need for organizations to sort of establish governance around data ownership, having sort of internal terms of service, if you want to call it that, like, who owns this data in terms of our own. This is the organization's data, and we need to treat it that way, if that
Yeah,
makes
that's
sense.
a great point. That's a really good point. That data ownership isn't just a legal state or status, but also a function, and a responsibility that the organization has.
Exactly.
So planning. What's the best way to go about planning a move to the cloud? Let's talk about that a little bit. First and foremost, don't start with the solution. Hopefully, if you've listened to any of our webinars or attended any IT nonprofit technology conferences like N10, you've heard this over and over again. But it's really important not to start with the solution. I think one of the people will say, oh, I want to go to I want to use Dropbox, and I'll pick on Dropbox because it's an easy example. Um, Dropbox may be a great solution, but don't start with that in mind. Don't say, well, we want to move to Dropbox. You want to take a few steps back and look at the problem that you're hoping Dropbox will solve. What's the problem? And so we're going to present uh, basically a methodology or an approach that can help you to identify what the problem might be. And it actually can also help with addressing the issue that Steve had just mentioned around data sprawl. So there's a um,
Let's
no, this is
let's
good.
skip ahead to you.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
this is good. This is good. Um, so this is a nice sort of diagram that you can use to inventory your data. It's information systems inventory, and basically what you do is you take your you sort of break your organization down into the different functional groups. So what are the information systems we use to be productive? What are the information systems used to help us manage our finances? What are the information systems we use to connect with our constituents? And then that's sort of the general functional area. And then what's the specific system that we're using? So in this, this is a very simple, basic example, but this organization is using Outlook, and they have a mobile interface to help them to help staff be more productive. They're using Great Plains Dynamics for their finance, and they're using Razor's Edge for their CRM. And what's the work that they're doing with these different systems? The work to be done, they're sending email to each other, they're scheduling meetings, they're being more productive, they're assigning tasks. On the finance side, they're using Great Plains as their general ledger, they're using it to manage AP and AR. And on the CRM, they're managing donor data, mailing lists, contact info. So that's the work to be done. Where does all of that data reside? Well, in the first case, it resides in an Exchange database that sits on an on-premise server. In the second two cases, it resides in a Great Plains database and a Blackbaud Razor's Edge database that share space on a virtual host. So these are each running as separate virtual servers on this single virtual host. And so going through this exercise can be really helpful. And you don't have to start at the top and work your way down. I sort of presented it in a linear fashion, but sometimes you can start with the work to be done. Like, okay, we're right now we have to manage. We do a couple projects where we do outreach to different groups that we're working with, and okay, that's the work to be done. How's that being managed? And then you can kind of work your way up and down from there. Or maybe you have a server in the closet and no one knows what it's there for or what it's doing. So okay, we've got this box. What's running on it, and you can kind of work your way up from there. So you really want to like attack this at every level. And if you do it thoroughly, you'll end up with a diagram that looks like this. It may not look like
Ta-da!
this. This is for, a 150, 200 person organization. Pretty complex. They have over a dozen databases here. They have a lot of different functions that they need to do as an organization. But I think one of the things that I've, come to respect and appreciate about nonprofits is they even the smallest nonprofits tend to be doing fairly sophisticated work, and as a result tend to have fairly sophisticated IT needs. So it may not look quite this complicated, but when you're done with that exercise, you really want to have something that captures the work that the organization is doing, the information that's being used to accomplish that work, and the systems that are being used to manage that information. Once you have that systems inventory, you can then start looking at which of these different systems do we want to move out into the cloud. And if you just look at, well, I want to take my on-premise Exchange database and move it to Office 365, you're kind of missing an opportunity to revise how your organization works. So cloud migration, it's really an opportunity to look at your business process. That was that kind of work to be done um, row in that diagram. It's a good opportunity to look at your organizational structure and your overall, strategy for how you function as a business. So we've got a couple examples here that sort of highlight this in greater detail.
So the Johan was mentioning the fact that what for many of our clients a first foray into sort of into the cloud might be to replace their on-premise Exchange server with Office 365. So that's what this might look like. And in fact, one of the reasons that this is a popular sort of first, well, one of the reasons it's a popular first project of moving things to the cloud is that Microsoft is generously making Office 365 available um, for $0 per user per month for the sort of basic E1 level for qualified 501c3s. But another reason that it's a popular sort of first step is that we can accurately tell our clients that in many ways, since in fact you're currently using an on-premise Exchange server, and Office 365, while it's software as a service, it's based on Microsoft running a bunch of their Exchange servers in Azure. And so you're still using the same Exchange server. And so though there might be an upgrade from Exchange 2007 to the latest Exchange 2013 when you move to Office 365, essentially you're still staying on the same internal data platform there, that middle row. And you're still going to be probably using the same user interface, Outlook, for your classic email desktop client, but also your iPhone or Android mobile email client. And so in many ways, this kind of migration to the cloud can be essentially transparent to your staff. And so that makes it attractive because there's not as much change management and you get the benefits of the cloud. You no longer, your total cost of ownership might go way down because you're not having to buy the servers and pay for the every couple of year migrations and so forth and so on. And maybe you're getting better uptime. I mean, it's not that Office 365 never goes out. Anybody that has Office 365, I'm sure, can tell you the story of the day that it went down and they really needed it to stay up. But for the most part, I mean, the uptime is certainly better on average than on-premise servers, which can always go down for all sorts of reasons. At least with Office 365, they have the scale to have multiple servers and redundancies and so forth. So that's all well and good, but it would be a mistake to just to ignore the opportunities that even this simple cloud migration can provide, because Office 365 is more than just Exchange. It's a software as a service that includes other things. It includes SharePoint. It includes Link. And we have Link highlighted here in the work to be done. So you may not have had any kind of enterprise instant messaging um, communications tool in your tool set before, but with Office 365, you can. And we ourselves have sort of been somewhat transformed in our operations by the fact that we've been using Office 365 Link at Community IT. So many things that used to be done by an email will now be done by a quick instant message. The um, impact that that has is often less, and often the response time is faster. I do a daily huddle with the product engineers that I work with using a Link video chat that's all virtual and allows us to sort of do a quick check-in every day, no matter where we all are. And we have engineers all over the place all the time. And so this has sort of changed sort of our productivity, allowing us to do some things that we couldn't have done before. And certainly, like today, I was actually talking to our CEO, and he's like, "Oh, my laptop microphone's not working. You have to call me on the phone." And I did. I called him on the phone, and it worked fine. Nothing wrong with the phone. But I realized just what a difference it makes to be able to, do a video chat with someone when you're trying to do a quick meeting, but you like the bandwidth of being able to see the person's expressions and so forth. It's a small thing, but it's not that small of a thing.
I think a more sophisticated or more involved cloud migration would be going from something like Razor's Edge, which you host on premise, to more of a sort of browser or mobile-based um, solution like Salesforce. And while you can certainly run Razor's Edge, basically, Razor's Edge kind of is a software as a solution in the sense that you can go with Blackbaud's hosted Razor's Edge. There are a few third-party providers that will allow you to use the Razor's Edge, but fundamentally, Razor's Edge is still the same client-server solution that it's always been, and all of the hosted versions of Razor's Edge require you to basically open up a virtual client on a virtual desktop, through over the internet, and that works fine, but it's a completely different experience from Salesforce, which was really built to run in a web browser and on the web, and now has a pretty good mobile app that you can use to access the information, and that's just not possible at all with Razor's Edge because of the architecture. So for those reasons and others, I know quite a few people are looking at making that switch, going from Razor's Edge to Salesforce. And while it's certainly possible to migrate your data over and continue to do the same things you were doing in Razor's Edge um, in Salesforce, there's a whole lot of other functionality that kind of gets opened up, and some of the ways in which you used to do things in Razor's Edge, you're not going to be able to do anymore in Salesforce. And so it's really important if you're looking to make that switch. It's not just a question of moving your data into the cloud, but it's really, a question of really kind of revamping all of the business processes that you've developed around interacting with your donors, your constituents with Salesforce, and figuring out how you're going to do that. I'm sorry, with Razor's Edge, and figuring out how you're going to do that with Salesforce, and then what new things are available to you. Like events management. There are things you can start to do in Salesforce with tracking the marketing. How the workflows of your outreach efforts. So it's not just a simple question of moving the data from one location to another, but really getting back into sort of the guts of the organization and reviewing how you work and how you're going to work.
And I wanted to add onto this slide an idea that is that I picked up from reading and hearing some podcasts. Someone named Steven Sinofsky, who was a major product manager at Microsoft for many, many years, and now I think he works for Andreessen Horowitz, but he helped sort of, he was in charge of the Microsoft Office suite development for like a decade at least. And he writes a lot about and thinks a lot about the fact that there's sort of a layer in here between that internal data layer and the work to be done layer that sometimes um, people stumble over. And I'm not sure I'm going to be explaining it there very well, but it's this idea that sometimes people get hung up on sort of the way the work is done and not what actually needs to be done. And if there might be an example might be if
Actually,
what we need to do is get a grant application out the door.
let me cut you off, Steve, because
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I've got a good and very humbling example from just this week. I do a lot of account management for our clients, and I have quite a few clients that I would meet with on a regular basis to kind of go over their plans and just kind of touch base. And I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years. So my method was I would put together a Word document agenda. I would go to the meeting, print it out, hand it out to everybody, take notes on my laptop, and then email out after the meeting the Word document of the notes. And that's just the habit that I got into. So that was my, kind of that middle layer you're talking about between the work to be done and the internal data. And it's like, oh, how can I put these Word documents in the cloud? And in my recent transition into my new role, I've been handing off, those responsibilities to our network managers. So I went to a meeting earlier this week, and the network manager said, "Okay, I sent the link out. I just sent the link out. You should all have it." And I was like, "Link? I mean, where's the paper? Where's the Word document?" And I clicked on the link, and OneNote Mobile opened up in my browser. Our contact had her iPhone. She opened it up there, and our network manager started taking notes as we were meeting. And the client was like, "Hey, I'm seeing these notes like on my phone as you're typing them. This is amazing. This is so much more efficient." And so it was really kind of a paradigm shift. Instead of like trying to find a way to get my old, you know, dusty Word documents into a cloud environment, it's like, hey, there's a whole new tool now that will change, how we do these things. So that was a good lesson for me in kind of the need to change how you work in order to better leverage cloud solutions.
Thanks, Johan. That's a good example of what I was getting at. Perfect. So we have some cloud migration best practices that we definitely want to highlight here as we get towards the end of this webinar. Um, First of all, it's not all or nothing. In fact, I would definitely say that uh, moving to the cloud should be bitten off in small bites and taken step by step. Uh, if you have lots and lots and lots of services right now on premise, pick and choose. Some of the services don't try to move everything to the cloud all at once. Unless there's some crazy need for it, like the fact that your server room is filling up with water every day or something. Might as well take things slowly. When you need to introduce a new service, if you're a very, very small organization and you've just been doing you've been doing your contact management by just using your Outlook contacts or an Excel spreadsheet where you keep track of what's going on, and it's like you're getting bigger, and it's time for you to think about an actual CRM. That would be a good time to look at the cloud's options in terms of your CRM. Why would you invest in something that needs to be installed on your desktop or on premise? And so new services are definitely the best place to look, a good place to look for the cloud. If you want to migrate existing services, we say to start with the low impact applications and get some momentum. That's why Office 365, emailed Office 365, is oftentimes a good starting place for sort of one of your first for a bigger. I guess it's not the most low impact app, but it's a nice one because it doesn't change things too much for the end user experience. So yeah, gain experience and get some momentum as you move on.
So this is pretty standard. It's kind of the if we were presenting this at a conference, we'd say go. You've probably heard this 20 times already, but these nevertheless these are this is tried and true steps to take when you're thinking about any sort of project, but especially an IT project and especially a cloud migration project. So you want to gather your requirements, and that's really what that hopefully that information systems inventory model is a great tool for helping you to gather those requirements. Once you've gathered the requirements, you want to put together a plan. What are the next steps? Are we going to, which one are we going to tackle first? You want to prioritize your different information systems. You want to make sure that there's someone in the organization who's leading it. And as obvious as that sounds, it happens all the time that people all think this is a good idea, but no one is sort of given ownership of making it happen. And that can often be the case if it's a smaller organization that doesn't necessarily have someone in charge of IT. It's still important to have someone who's kind of owning the project. I would strongly recommend, unless it's a really small organization, starting with a pilot group. So even a 15-person organization, pick 2 or 3 people, a nice representative sample of, the most tech-savvy person and the least tech-savvy person in the organization. Ideally, people from different departments. If you're looking at systems that cross multiple departments, have them look at and use the system first. Especially even if it's a system that only has a short trial period, see if they'll let you sign up for a small number of users and then scale up later. Make sure they have a month-to-month contract rather than a 12-year contract, 12-month, definitely not 12-year, 12-month contract. I think that it's just a great way to kind of get some real-time experience. It's just impossible to understand how a system is going to affect your organization by watching a few videos on the firm's website. Make sure you provide training. This is critical. Even with a migration as simple as going from on-premise Exchange to Office 365 requires training, and that requirement only grows as the change becomes more pronounced. And then finally, you want to get feedback from your staff even after you've moved to the cloud. Make sure the feedback can really help with sort of ongoing changes. And it's moving to the cloud in any IT project never really has a start and an end. It's something you begin and then you're constantly sort of improving and optimizing over time. Great. Well, thank you all for hanging with us here today. If you have any additional questions, I would suggest shooting those up right now on the GoToWebinar interface, and we can stick around a little bit after 5 to answer those. You can also shoot your questions over to us on Twitter. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Our next webinar, Thursday, September 25th, is Rosh Hashanah, and so we're going to be having our webinar in September on Wednesday. So that's a slight change from our usual schedule. It'll be Wednesday, September 24th from 3 to 4 p.m. In the next webinar, we're going to talk about supporting remote staff. I don't think I have worked with an organization or talked to an organization in the last 2 or 3 years that hasn't had at least one person working remotely part of the time. And most organizations now have more than one person working remotely, many of them all the time. So that can present a lot of challenges, but there's definitely some things you can do when you're planning out your IT and looking at your infrastructure to help support those staff. So we're going to talk about that next month. Finally,